Did America's national parks begin as a simple idea, or as a radical dream to save what could never be replaced? Who first decided that mountains, forests, and rivers should belong to everyone, not just the wealthy few? And what struggles shaped the parks we wander through today, from Yellowstone to Yosemite and beyond? From wild frontier lands to treasured symbols of peace and beauty. This is the story of how a nation learned to protect its soul through nature. Tonight we'll explore the entire history of American national parks. Before you settle in, take a moment to like and subscribe. But only if this kind of quiet storytelling truly helps you relax and unwind. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Share where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. I really enjoy reading what you write, and it's comforting to see people from all around the world gathering here, slowly winding down side by side, even though we're far apart. Now, make yourself comfortable. Dim the lights, and if you'd like, switch on a fan or a little white noise for that steady background hum that helps the world fade away. Let your breathing slow, let your body relax, and together we'll drift into tonight's story at an easy, gentle pace.
Chapter 1. Early American Conservation, Yellowstone and the Idea of Preservation. It's a truly peaceful thought, isn't it, that certain places are set aside forever. The idea that the most beautiful, massive, unique, and impressive natural and historical sites in America are saved not just for visitors today, but for generations to come, is often called America's best idea. We're going to begin tonight by exploring how this magnificent idea was born, starting when America itself was a very different place. Not so long ago, America was a vast, untamed continent. Endless forests were only broken up by wild, unpredictable rivers. Mountain ranges seemed to divide the land with very few passes through them, and there were great stretches of inhospitable deserts and vast seas of grassland. The early Americans we know at that time really only had one driving goal, and that was to conquer it all. Guided by the popular philosophy of manifest destiny, the United States actively set about taming this massive wilderness. They cleared entire forests, carved up the mountains, and eventually dammed those unpredictable rivers. As settlers looked westward, especially following the American Civil War, they were often seeking to escape the horrors of the past and start a new life full of opportunity in these open lands. As more and more immigrants continued to pour off the boats on the East Coast, the need for land grew, and more people were pushed further west. But not everyone who ventured into the wild was looking only to conquer and exploit. As prospectors looked for gold and farmers sought new lands, more and more incredible natural wonders were being discovered, mapped, and photographed. These images of unbelievable places began to spread far and wide, but as the West was won, a new conflict against man was quietly brewing. Under increased threats of development and destruction, these priceless lands were quickly falling into danger. This is where the earliest American conservationists step in. Though they were relatively unknown at the time, people like John Muir and Glenn Clark would eventually become legends, standing alongside great figures like President Teddy Roosevelt. These pioneering conservationists and explorers led the effort to advocate for the land, and their tireless work saved America's natural treasures. Their petitioning of the United States government for the preservation of these most valuable national wonders led to what would be called America's greatest idea. Before the idea of a national park truly took hold, there was an important preservation effort in California. The California Gold Rush, which occurred during the 1850s, had already seen many of the state's beautiful valleys and forests utterly destroyed in the search for riches. However, the Yosemite Valley dodged its first bullet because miners who ventured in found nothing worth staying for. As rumors of this magical granite lion valley, with its massive waterfalls and trees that reached into the sky, slowly trickled out, Glenn Clark set about exploring these claims. He hiked the mountains, stood on the cliff edges, and camped underneath ancient trees, some of which were thousands of years old. It's hard to wrap your mind around the sheer amount of time those individual trees had stood on the face of the earth. Clark knew this place was profoundly special, and he also knew that if action wasn't taken soon, it would be overrun by farms. The rivers would be dammed, the forests would be cut down, and everything that made Yosemite special would be erased by generations of exploitation. Because of the lobbying efforts of Glenn Clark and others, President Abraham Lincoln took a monumental step in 1864. He established the Yosemite Grant, which gave this land, which was unpatented federal land, to the state of California to manage as a preserve. The purpose of this grant was for public use, resort, and recreation, protected from all time. This early preservation effort helped pave a vital way for the national park system that we cherish today. Then, just a few years later, came the real birth of the movement. In 1872, the 42nd Congress of the United States passed the Yellowstone National Park Protection Act. Yellowstone, then as now, was truly an exceptional corner of the country. The pictures and descriptions coming back east from this wild region must have seemed absolutely otherworldly. Imagine massive herds of bison, colorful geothermal springs, and huge waterfalls carving out deep canyons. Many visitors today don't even realize that Yellowstone National Park sits within the confines of one of the world's largest active volcanoes. There was, and still is, simply nothing else quite like it. Thanks to the early conservation efforts, Yellowstone is still here today. More than just a location, Yellowstone National Park is an idea itself, an idea about preservation, about families, and about securing a future. It was the first national park in the United States, and it is widely regarded as the first national park in the entire world. America's preservation idea quickly became a blueprint for future generations. However, the path forward wasn't immediately clear, and even today, finding the right balance between public accessibility and ecological preservation remains a difficult challenge. We see this early struggle clearly when we look at America's second national park, which was added just 3 years after Yellowstone, but barely lasted 20 years. That was Mackinac National Park, located in Michigan. Mackinac Island was in stark contrast to the massive, wild wilderness of Yellowstone. It protected just over 800 acres, and unlike Yellowstone, which was extremely remote, Mackinac was located in the booming Great Lakes region. While Yellowstone was attractive just for its immense natural resources, Mackinac Island was already next to a popular destination and a military outpost. At the time, the concept of conservation was still new and maturing. There was a significant debate over what land should and shouldn't be protected. Mackinac Island seemed like a logical choice because it was immediately under threat from intense development, where its natural beauty might have become its curse. This is exactly the kind of situation the National Park System was designed to prevent. The Protection Act for Mackinac set aside 821 acres and included the island's iconic natural features like Arch Rock and Sugarloaf. A small area was also reserved for Fort Mackinac, and the fort's commander actually ran the park, with federal troops serving as the first rangers, much like they did at Yellowstone. But there was a crucial problem with this early arrangement. The park was allowed to lease small numbers of lots and buildings to offset the running costs, because no federal money was provided to run the park. The park also had to be available for military training, which is something we would find unthinkable in our national parks today. When the fort was decommissioned in 1895, the park's future became immediately uncertain, and at the request of the Michigan governor, it was turned over to the state. America's second national park was officially dissolved, becoming Mackinac Island State Park. Ironically, as a state park, Mackinac thrived with better funding and more local oversight. The debate over whether a place is exceptional enough for the national park system and what specific lands need protection still rings true today. The idea of preservation, however, was clearly taking root and spreading. Just before Mackinac dissolved, the next 3 national parks were added in 1890. These included Rock Creek Park in Washington, D.C., which would later merge into National Capital Parks, and most famously, Sequoia and Yosemite National Parks. Sequoia National Park, located on the western slope of the southern Sierra Nevada in California, became a park in September 1890. It's a vast landscape of rugged, wild terrain. It protects the highest point in the lower 48 states, Mount Whitney, and is home to the General Sherman tree, one of the largest trees on Earth by sheer volume. Yosemite was added as a national park just a few days later. This move finally secured the protection of this internationally recognized landscape, known for its magnificent granite cliffs, massive waterfalls, clear streams, lakes, and its unique biodiversity. By the end of the 19th century, the idea of preservation was established in America. Though the balance between protecting wild lands and making them accessible to people was still being negotiated, Yellowstone stood as a powerful, shining example of what could be accomplished when the government acted to conserve these extraordinary places for future generations. Chapter 2. The Battle for Yosemite. Grantlands and Early Park Preservation. As we drift into the quiet history of America's great natural spaces tonight, we're focusing our attention on one valley that became absolutely central to the whole idea of conservation: Yosemite. It's a place of such breathtaking, almost unimaginable beauty that the effort to protect it started even before the National Park Service itself was formed. To understand why Yosemite needed protection so desperately, we first have to remember what America was like in the middle of the 19th century. It was a very different country than the one we know today. The Americans of that time held a deep, driving philosophy, often called manifest destiny, believing it was their fate to conquer and tame the entire continent. The lands stretching westward were seen as a wild, untamed wilderness that needed to be subdued, exploited, and controlled. The goal was simple: conquer it all. And they came close to succeeding. They cleared entire forests, carved up the huge mountain ranges, and even successfully dammed the unpredictable rivers. This push westward was fueled by many factors. Following the terrible American Civil War, many settlers looked west to escape the horrors of their past and seek new lives full of opportunity in these open lands. Meanwhile, massive numbers of immigrants were pouring off the boats on the East Coast, which increased the demand for land and pushed more people further west. The environmental cost of this rush was immense. We see this very clearly in California, especially during the gold rush of the 1850s. In the frantic search for riches, many of the state's beautiful valleys and forests were utterly destroyed. The land was ravaged, but fortunately, the immense, iconic Yosemite Valley managed to avoid its first bullet. Many miners ventured into this region looking for gold, but their pans came up empty, so they quickly moved on to more promising areas. But as the West was won, the lands that were being newly discovered, mapped, and photographed were slowly falling into serious danger under the increased threat of human development. A new kind of battle was brewing, not against the natives or the elements, but against the relentless drive of human exploitation. Fortunately, not everyone who ventured into the wild was looking only to conquer and exploit. This is where the earliest American conservationists stepped forward. Though they were relatively unknown at the time, figures like John Muir and Glenn Clark would eventually become true legends, earning their place alongside great presidents and explorers. These pioneers led the way, dedicating their tireless efforts to saving America's most incredible natural wonders. They petitioned the United States government repeatedly to preserve America's most valuable national treasures. The story of Yosemite's preservation hinges on one particular advocate, Glenn Clark. As rumors slowly trickled out from California of the magical Granite Lion Valley, with its massive waterfalls and trees reaching impossibly high into the sky, Clark set out to explore these claims for himself. Imagine standing where he stood. Clark hiked the mountains, gazed down from the cliff's edges, and camped beneath those truly massive trees. Some of those individual trees had stood right there on the face of the earth for thousands of years. He knew instantly that this place was profoundly special, unlike any other corner of the country. And he understood that time was running out. If no action was taken soon, the land would be overrun by farms, the beautiful rivers would be permanently dammed, the ancient forests would be cut down, and everything that made Yosemite special would be utterly destroyed and erased by generations of exploitation. The urgency of this looming environmental disaster drove Clark and his allies to lobby hard for federal protection. They succeeded in securing one of the most important pieces of early conservation legislation in American history. In 1864, right in the middle of the Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln took a monumental step. He established the Yosemite Grant. This was the first time that federal land had been protected solely because of its natural beauty, marking a crucial shift in how America viewed its wilderness. The Yosemite Grant took this unpatented federal land and transferred it to the state of California, putting it in trust to be managed as a preserve. The purpose was clear and ambitious: to set aside the valley for public use, resort, and recreation from all time. This critical early effort paved a vital way for the larger national park system that would follow. This political action didn't happen in a vacuum, though. It was greatly influenced by a burgeoning cultural movement that valued nature's majesty. Crucial to this shift in public opinion were the new technologies of the day, particularly photography. As the West was explored, incredible natural wonders were not just mapped, but also photographed. These images spread far and wide, letting people back east see the stunning reality of places like Yosemite. A photographer named Carlton Watkins ventured into the largely uncharted valley more than 160 years ago and captured jaw-dropping landscapes of this secret American wilderness. It's noted that his photos and the subsequent advocacy were what truly inspired President Lincoln to sign that landmark legislation establishing the grant. Photography gave the American public a reason to care about land they had never seen. However, the preservation battle wasn't completely over. The 1864 grant protected the Yosemite Valley floor, but the surrounding lands were still vulnerable to misuse and development. It took another quarter century before full protection was secured. Just a few days after Sequoia National Park was established in September 1890, Yosemite was finally added as a full national park. This move secured the protection of this internationally recognized landscape. Today, Yosemite is celebrated globally for those magnificent granite cliffs, massive waterfalls, clear streams, lakes, mountains, meadows, and its spectacular giant sequoia groves. It's recognized for its truly unique biodiversity. In fact, nearly 95% of the park has been officially designated as wilderness, meaning it's purposefully removed from roads, buildings, and permanent structures, ensuring its wildness remains intact. Furthermore, the park's boundaries encompass the Merced River Canyon, which remains one of the last undammed sections of whitewater in all of California. The early preservation efforts at Yosemite, sparked by the vision of advocates like Glenn Clark and sanctioned by President Lincoln through the Yosemite Grant, provided a resounding success story in American conservation. It demonstrated that America was capable of valuing its wilderness not just for what it could provide economically, but for its intrinsic beauty, setting a powerful and lasting precedent for protecting extraordinary places for future generations to explore and enjoy. The original Native American name for the valley, Ahwahnee, meaning large gaping mouth, perfectly describes the awe and wonder that this protected place still inspires. Chapter 3, Unifying Federal Lands, the Organic Act and the National Park Service. Let's settle in and think about how the beautiful, special places we've discussed finally came together under one unified banner. By the early 1900s, the United States government had slowly accumulated many federally protected areas across the country. Some of these were officially named national parks, like Yellowstone, Sequoia, and Yosemite. Others were designated as national monuments or other reservations, but they didn't have a single system to look after them, and that created real problems for management. This patchwork of protected lands needed an organized structure. The idea of preservation was strong, but the actual day-to-day work of managing these remote, vast, and complex areas was scattered across different departments, often with competing priorities. For instance, in the early days, military personnel, like the Fort Commander and federal troops at Mackinac National Park and Yellowstone, served as the first rangers. This arrangement sometimes led to parks being available for military training, which we'd find pretty unthinkable today. Mackinac itself, America's second national park, only lasted 20 years before it was turned over to the state, in part because there was no federal money provided to run the park. These early struggles made it clear that a cohesive, well-funded, and dedicated system was desperately needed to ensure the long-term future of these treasures. In 1916, that organization finally arrived. These protected sites across the U.S. would become unified under one umbrella organization, the National Park Service. The legislation that created it is called the Organic Act, and it's held as one of the most lasting and important pieces of legislation in American history. This one piece of legislation single-handedly created the National Park Service for the first time. America's natural wonders would be protected under a single department with a single goal. The Organic Act of 1916 laid out a monumental task for the new agency. The National Park Service was established to promote and regulate the use of federal areas known as national parks, monuments, and reservations. Crucially, the system was tasked to conserve the scenery and the natural and historical objects within them. This mandate required the Park Service to balance two very tall, sometimes conflicting tasks: preservation and public use. They had to conserve the land, but they also had to promote its enjoyment by the public in a way that left the lands unimpaired for future generations. This mission, to balance accessibility and preservation, remains a tough one to find even today. Think about the atmosphere in America at the beginning of the 20th century. The age of the train was in full swing, and long-distance travel was measured in days and weeks, not hours. Because the parks were often very remote, the railroad companies were closely involved in the development of the early visitor centers at places like Grand Canyon, Glacier, and Yellowstone National Parks. These early facilities still survive today as pieces of nostalgia and entertainment within the parks. Visiting a national park often meant a significant commitment of time and resources, meaning that for many, it was a rare and special trip. The early leaders of the National Park Service quickly realized they needed to prepare for change. In the coming decades, steel and rail travel would slowly be replaced by asphalt and rubber tires as the automobile became the primary mode of transportation within the national parks. But in 1916, the focus was on establishing this new agency and defining what conservation really meant. The establishment of the Park Service helped cement the public's view of these protected lands as a shared national heritage. Places like Yellowstone, which was the first national park in the United States and widely regarded as the first in the world, were already powerful symbols. Yellowstone was more than just a location. It was an idea about preservation, about families, and about securing a tomorrow. America's idea of preservation set a blueprint for future generations. The Organic Act provided the legal framework to protect places based on their natural beauty, unique geological features, diverse ecosystems, historical significance, and recreational opportunities. It recognized that places like the immense, rugged Sequoia National Park, with Mount Whitney, the highest point in the lower 48 states, and the General Sherman tree, one of the largest trees on Earth by volume, needed permanent conservation. It also protected the internationally recognized landscapes of Yosemite, with its granite cliffs, waterfalls, streams, and unique biodiversity. Interestingly, the Park Service started with only a handful of natural sites, but its scope would soon grow much wider. Although the initial focus of national parks and monuments was largely on geological wonders, there were other important American sites under federal control that weren't under the new park umbrella. By 1933, the National Park Service would undergo a major transformation. President Franklin D. Roosevelt used the Reorganization Act of 1933 to transfer national monuments from one government agency to another. This seemingly technical action allowed him to expand the scope of the National Park Service in an unexpected and profound way. In 1933, Roosevelt issued two key executive actions. First, he absorbed Civil War sites and many other national monuments into the National Park Service, forever changing the department's scope. Before this, places like Civil War battlefields had been preserved under the War Department, but they seemed a natural fit for the National Park Service since they were important to American history. Second, many locations in Washington, D.C. that had previously required an act of Congress to consolidate, like Rock Creek Park, were now placed underneath a new unit called the National Capital Park. This consolidation of historical sites alongside natural wonders emphasized that the National Park Service was the custodian of America's irreplaceable historical treasures, as well as its extraordinary landscapes. From then on, the Park Service would protect not only the iconic natural beauty of places like Yosemite and Yellowstone, but also historical battlefields and cultural sites, cementing the idea that the parks were truly America's shared national heritage. In many ways, the creation of the National Park Service and the passage of the Organic Act in 1916 marked the transition from simply setting aside land, like the early Yosemite Grant in 1864, to actively managing it for both conservation and enjoyment. This unified, systematic approach ensured that the concept of America's best idea could truly endure, protecting the land and allowing the public to get out and explore these special places. The challenge of balancing preservation and access, which was present in 1916, continues to be central to the National Park Service's mission. They are constantly working to ensure that the scenery, natural objects, and historical treasures remain conserved, while also accommodating the millions upon millions of visitors who come each year to explore, seek adventure, and connect with America's wild past. Chapter 4. The Great Depression Era, the Civilian Conservation Corps, and expanding sites to battlefields. It's a calm moment to consider how the national park system, which started with a few spectacular wilderness areas, was profoundly changed by one of America's most challenging periods, the Great Depression. This era of immense national struggle actually led to innovative programs that expanded the Park Service's responsibilities and resulted in a legacy of enduring infrastructure we still depend on today. By 1933, the National Park Service had been officially established for nearly 2 decades, carrying the dual mission set by the Organic Act of 1916 to conserve the scenery and natural and historical objects within the parks, while simultaneously providing for the public's enjoyment of those lands. However, the system of federally protected lands was still scattered. While the iconic natural wonders like Yellowstone and Yosemite were under the Park Service's care, many other significant American sites were being managed by different agencies across the government. The Great Depression created an immediate and desperate need for national recovery and employment. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal programs were sweeping across the nation, and these efforts would dramatically shape the national parks. Roosevelt made several key strategic moves in 1933 that fundamentally expanded the scope and the very identity of the National Park Service. The first major shift came through the Reorganization Act of 1933. This act granted the president the authority to transfer national monuments from one government agency to another. Roosevelt used this power in a sweeping and unexpected way. It seemed only natural that since national parks and monuments were designed to protect important American history and geological wonders, many other types of federally controlled lands should fall underneath the National Park Service umbrella. Think about the historical sites managed outside the system at that time. Before 1933, sites with immense historical significance, such as the Civil War battlefields, had been preserved and managed under the War Department. But in that transformative year, Roosevelt issued executive actions that changed this fragmented management forever. First, he absorbed these Civil War sites and many other national monuments into the National Park Service, fundamentally altering the department's scope. This consolidation emphasized that the National Park Service wasn't just the custodian of extraordinary natural landscapes, but it was also the keeper of America's irreplaceable historical treasures, including cultural sites and battlefields. Second, many locations in Washington, D.C. that had previously taken an act of Congress to consolidate and organize, like Rock Creek Park, were now placed underneath a new unit called the National Capital Park. Rock Creek Park was one of the earliest protected sites, formed in 1890, but this new arrangement placed it firmly under the Park Service's expanding authority. This change ensured that the National Park Service was fully established as the custodian of America's shared national heritage, encompassing both massive natural wilderness and highly significant historical and cultural sites. The second, and perhaps the most iconic, transformation of this era was the creation of the Civilian Conservation Corps. This was one of the most significant New Deal-era programs, established as a work relief program aimed specifically at putting America's unemployed youth to work. The premise was straightforward: offer young men unemployment relief by having them perform simple labor tasks, allowing them to earn money to send back home to their struggling families. At the time, economic opportunities were terribly scarce, with unemployment nationally hitting nearly 25%, a statistic that was even higher for poorly educated teenagers from rural areas. The Civilian Conservation Corps initially offered young men $30 a month, which was a very significant amount of money in the midst of the Great Depression. A large portion of this money was routinely sent back to their families for safekeeping, providing absolutely crucial financial relief during the worst economic downturn in modern American history. Beyond just employment, the program provided essential needs like clothes, food, and shelter for these young men. The program later expanded to include young men aged 17 to 28. But the goals of the Civilian Conservation Corps went far beyond simply providing immediate jobs. A key goal was restoring national morale. The program sought to instill an ideology of manly outdoor work to help counter the pervasive economic depression and provide essential cash relief for families. Through a rigorous regiment of heavy manual labor, civic and political education, and an all-male living and working environment, the Civilian Conservation Corps sought to build a better man who would be economically independent and self-reliant. Historical records show the enormous need for this relief, noting that at the time of entry, a staggering 70% of enrollees were malnourished and poorly clothed. Enrollment in the Civilian Conservation Corps peaked near the end of 1935, when approximately 500,000 men were set across 2,600 camps operating in every single state, all receiving equal pay and equal housing. These young men accomplished an astonishing amount of work in the national parks and forests. They dedicated themselves to public works projects that greatly enhanced conservation and improved the visitor experience. They built essential roads, cut hiking trails, and constructed vital infrastructure, much of which you can still use and enjoy in the parks today. The work done by the Civilian Conservation Corps was essential for preparing the parks for the decades to come. Their projects were focused on conservation efforts that would allow the public to explore these areas safely and comfortably. Many of the experiences we associate with visiting a national park today, such as hiking the trails, staying at a cabin, or enjoying a picnic at established picnic tables, can be traced back to the fundamental infrastructure built by the young men of the Civilian Conservation Corps. Their immense collective effort effectively married the urgent goals of national recovery and long-term conservation. This work helped to solidify the idea that conserving America's natural and historical resources was a crucial national priority. The work of the Civilian Conservation Corps continued right up until World War II. By 1939, there was a shift in focus, moving the men away from hard manual conservation work toward training highly skilled citizen soldiers ready for the coming global conflict. By 1942, the demands for construction workers were outweighed by wartime needs, and the Civilian Conservation Corps was officially disbanded. Many of the young men who had served in the program took the construction and labor skills they had learned and applied them directly to the war effort, building infrastructure for the military. But the lasting impact of this era carries on long after the civilian conservation corps camps were closed. The consolidation of historical sites alongside natural wonders, combined with the vast infrastructure improvements, ensured that when World War II finally ended, the national park system was physically prepared to accommodate the millions of young men and women returning home. In the late 1940s and 1950s, the returning young service members and their families, often called the baby boomers, looked to take their children into America's national parks, seeking adventure and escape in these protected areas. These baby boomers grew up exploring the natural wonders of our country, and they did so largely thanks to the infrastructure laid down during the challenging years of the Great Depression. The Park Service had not only expanded its legal responsibility to protect a wider range of American heritage, but it also had the physical means built by the Civilian Conservation Corps to handle this new influx of visitors, even if that infrastructure would eventually become decades old and require major upgrades soon enough. The New Deal era gave the National Park Service its lasting identity as the steward of America's most precious places, both natural and historical, and the Civilian Conservation Corps made them accessible to everyone. Chapter 5, Post-War Parks, Mission 66, and the Automobile Infrastructure Upgrade. Let's turn our attention to the period following World War II, a time of immense change and optimism in America, and see how this era completely reshaped the national park system through a massive modernization effort called Mission 66. By the late 1940s and the 1950s, the young men returning home from the war, often called the GYs, were eager to take their growing families, the baby boom children, into America's national parks. They were looking for adventure and a much-needed escape in these protected areas. The baby boomers grew up exploring the natural wonders of our country, solidifying the idea that the parks were a shared national heritage. However, there was a major issue that quickly became apparent. The infrastructure of the parks was simply not ready for this massive influx of visitors. Many of the original buildings and structures, even those built during the Great Depression by the Civilian Conservation Corps, were decades old. The parks were struggling to meet the new demands of their visitors. Gone were the days of primitive campgrounds, limited utilities, and small crowds. The national park system was under immense pressure and wasn't meeting the expectations of the public. The biggest transformation that necessitated this change was how Americans were now traveling. The automobile had firmly replaced trains as the primary mode of transportation within the national parks. Cars need good roads, places to park, towns nearby to fill up on gas, and shops to repair them when they broke down. The development of the U.S. highway system, which had been a public works project during the Great Depression, meant that many previously remote parks had become easily accessible via good roads. Inexpensive cars made this travel even easier. Car culture was quickly becoming an integral part of the American experience. Visitors weren't just driving to the parks, they were living in them, or near them, in a new way. The atomic era brought many new comforts into the average American home, and when Americans went camping, they often brought miniature homes with them in the form of travel trailers. This placed all new stresses on the park system, especially on the campgrounds and roads. By the mid-1950s, it was crystal clear that a massive investment in the park infrastructure was required. Something needed to be done quickly to bring the facilities up to the standards the public was now expecting. In 1951, Conrad Worth became the director of the National Park Service. His main goal was straightforward but monumental: get the parks back up to standard. The veterans of World War II were now elected officials, dads and husbands, and they were facing a new challenge in domestic life. The baby boom was on, and the influx of children created a massive need for cheap adventures into the national parks. Recognizing this need, President Dwight D. Eisenhower signed off on Mission 66 in 1952. This program was a massive 10-year effort designed to upgrade and expand park facilities in time for the 50th anniversary of the National Park Service in 1966. Mission 66 aimed to accommodate the rapidly increasing visitor numbers and provide high-quality interpretive facilities. The program involved a variety of vital infrastructure projects, including roads, utilities, and employee housing. The most visible component of this transformation, however, was the creation of the interpretive centers and new visitor centers inside the parks. With this major overhaul came the birth of the modern visitor center concept. These centers were designed as the first point of contact between the Park Service and its visitors. They were places where the visitor's adventure began. They were created to offer information, orientation, and to meet basic physical needs, like taking a bathroom break. The National Park Service put considerable emphasis on appropriate orientation and learning opportunities that these visitor centers could provide, especially for families entering Mother Nature for the very first time. These centers laid out the important information that visitors would need not only to enjoy their trips safely, but also to take care of these precious parks. Mission 66 didn't just focus on existing parks. New parks were added to the system to preserve unique American resources. Places like Cape Cod, Point Reyes, Fire Island, and Padre Island were all incorporated into the system under Mission 66. This expansion reflected a growing understanding that different types of landscapes, such as seashores and lakeshores, were worthy of federal protection and offered important recreational opportunities. While a large portion of the funding for Mission 66 was devoted to upgrading visitor facilities, the program also had a crucial focus on its staff. It put an emphasis on housing for the volunteers and workers. Much of the existing employee housing was built by the Civilian Conservation Corps and often amounted to little more than cabins at that time. Using a model of post-war military and suburban housing, a series of standardized designs was developed, focusing on the ranch-style detached houses popular at the time. Due to the remoteness of many of the national parks, this new employee housing was greatly needed. By 1966, when the Park Service turned 50 years old, Mission 66 had achieved its goals. The emphasis began to subtly shift from simply saving the great natural wonders and scenic features to making our parks much more accessible to the public. The director at the time, George Herzog, began the process of creating national lakeshores and national recreation areas, a new category of units that allowed for greater public engagement and development focused on recreation. The rise of the automobile culture and the completion of Mission 66 fundamentally changed the experience of visiting a park. It was now an experience centered around driving and stopping at purpose-built visitor centers. The optimism of mid-20th century America was reflected in these new, modern, and often architecturally distinctive visitor centers, built to handle millions of visitors a year. The parks were ready for the future, a future where accessibility and recreation were as important as preservation. The Mission 66 program provided the essential upgrades needed to ensure that the national park system could continue to serve as a refuge and an escape for millions of Americans seeking connection with the outdoors. It was an era that recognized that the parks needed to adapt to the reality of the modern American traveler, ensuring that the legacy of conservation born in the wilderness of Yellowstone, could thrive in the age of the automobile. Chapter 6. New Access to Nature, National Lakeshores and Recreation Areas. Let's settle our thoughts tonight and focus on a remarkable shift in how America viewed its protected lands. Following the immense infrastructure projects of Mission 66, the national park system entered a new era. The emphasis began to subtly turn from solely saving the great natural wonders and scenic features to actively making our parks more accessible to the general public. The post-World War II period saw millions of young Americans, often called the baby boomers, growing up exploring the natural wonders of our country, cementing the idea that the parks were a shared national heritage. But these families weren't always looking for the remote, rugged wilderness of the traditional parks like Yellowstone, which often required weeks of travel. They needed recreational opportunities closer to home, and the National Park Service began to adapt to this demand. It was during this time that the director of the National Park Service, George Herzog, began the process of creating national lakeshores and national recreation areas. These new types of units were different. While the original national park status was reserved for lands set aside for their natural beauty, unique geological features, diverse ecosystems, historical significance, and recreational opportunities, these new areas placed a much stronger emphasis on that last word, recreation. The National Park Service system already contained almost 20 categories of units beyond the four main types, which include national parks, national monuments, national historical parks, and historical sites. These new national lakeshores, seashores, and recreational areas quickly became popular additions. The expansion was fast. Between 1955 and 1963, 27 new units were added to the National Park Service, and many of these fell into this new category of recreational units. Many of the earliest sites incorporated reflected this new coastal focus, often added during the Mission 66 modernization program itself. For instance, Cape Cod, Point Reyes, Fire Island, and Padre Island were all incorporated into the system during this period. This inclusion showed a growing understanding that different types of landscapes, such as seashores and lakeshores, were worthy of federal protection and offered important public recreational opportunities. The focus on water-based recreation proved incredibly popular. National lake and seashores combined cover 826,000 acres of land and water, and they see up to 25 million visitors annually. National recreation areas are even more popular, drawing in almost 50 million visitors annually across 3.7 million acres. This massive visitor count underscores the success of this shift toward making nature more accessible. These new designations also reflected a desire to protect and preserve natural areas that were close to large cities, lands that were under immediate threat of becoming developed out of existence. The National Park Service realized that for many Americans, a large, remote wilderness trip wasn't feasible, but access to a wild landscape near their homes was essential for their well-being. The Golden Gate National Recreation Area, established later in the century, perfectly exemplifies this urban access philosophy. It certainly doesn't look like most national parks. It connects wild landscapes with the big city, stretching across 80,000 acres north and south of the bay. This park is one of the world's largest, encompassing 37 distinct sites, 140 miles of trails, 1,200 historic structures, and that one iconic bridge. It's an example of providing peace and sanctuary to visitors, even right next to a bustling modern metropolis. Another powerful example is Biscayne National Park, which sits right on the doorstep of Miami. It's a very different kind of park, being 95% underwater. Biscayne was established as a national monument in 1968. This action was critical because it halted developers who were already beginning to plow a highway through Elliott Key. Its designation ensures the protection of incredible coastal ecosystems. The park's mangrove forests and the Florida Reef, which is the third largest coral reef in the world, protect the coastline and millions of people from destructive waves and erosion. Thus, the park serves both conservation and public safety, all while offering sanctuary to both wildlife and human visitors, despite its close proximity to a massive city. However, this shift toward recreation also introduced a significant tension into the core mission of the National Park Service: the balance between preservation and public use. The new focus on providing broad recreational opportunities meant that some of these units were developed in ways that might have been unthinkable in the traditional wilderness-first national parks. A striking example of this is the development of several national recreation areas in conjunction with the Bureau of Reclamation, often built around new dam projects. Glen Canyon National Recreation Area, spanning southern Utah and northern Arizona, is known particularly for Lake Powell and the Colorado River. Lake Powell is not a natural lake. It was formed by a dam in the 1960s, which caused the canyon behind it to be permanently flooded. This vast body of water became a major destination for adventure seekers, offering boating and kayaking access to the remaining canyons. This development focused on creating new recreational areas by destroying an original canyon environment, stood in stark contrast to the preservation objectives upon which the National Park Service was originally founded. The original goal was to leave the lands unimpaired for future generations, but here the land was fundamentally and intentionally altered for current recreation. Yet the popularity was undeniable. The recreation areas quickly rivaled many of the traditional national parks as popular destinations. The creation of these new units gave visitors the freedom to choose how they wanted to explore the areas, emphasizing recreational opportunities. Whether it was kayaking in Glen Canyon, hiking in a large urban reserve like the Golden Gate, or relaxing by the newly protected seashores, these units broaden the meaning of American conservation. The National Park Service was no longer exclusively the custodian of remote geological wonders. It became the steward of a wider range of American heritage and provided lands specifically dedicated to public enjoyment and play. This ensured that the American idea of conservation could thrive in the age of the automobile, accessible to millions. Chapter 7. Ecological Science Shifts: Wildfires, Lodgepole Pines, and Natural Fire Management. The way America manages its protected lands underwent a profound but quiet transformation in the latter half of the 20th century, particularly concerning one natural force: fire. For many years, dating back well before the 1960s, fire was generally believed to be detrimental to the parks and forests, and management policies were always aimed at suppressing fires as quickly and completely as possible. The common view was that fire was a destroyer, capable of searing a timbered area for generations to come. This belief became formal policy in 1935 when the United States Forest Service adopted a formal policy that stated wildfires were supposed to be suppressed by 10 o'clock in the morning on the day they were first spotted. Achieving this ambitious goal required every precaution. Firefighting apparatus became standard equipment in all national parks. fire towers were constructed, and location finders and communication lines were established. Firefighting crews were created throughout the public lands, and these teams were generally staffed by young men. By the beginning of World War II, more than 8,000 fire lookout towers had been constructed in the United States alone. The need for lumber was high during World War II, meaning fires destroying timberland were deemed unacceptable. In fighting these forest fires, time was precious. Even the fastest combination of vehicles, horses, and foot travel often permitted small fires to gain momentum and become large conflagrations before they could be reached and controlled. To combat this speed, the idea of the smoke jumper, a firefighter who parachuted into remote areas, emerged around 1940. These aggressive and total firefighting efforts proved highly successful in the short term. The area burned by wildfires was drastically reduced, dropping from an annual average of 30 million acres in the 1930s to somewhere between 2 and 5 million acres by the 1960s. This success in suppression, however, unintentionally short-circuited a natural system. To further educate the public about the perceived dangers of fire, the United States Forest Service developed an extensive advertisement campaign in 1944. This campaign featured a cartoon black bear named Smokey, an iconic firefighting bear who could still be seen on many posters with the famous catchphrase, "Only you can prevent forest fires." Unfortunately, these posters were very misleading to the public, leading people to believe that most wildfires were predominantly human-caused. In fact, in a place like Yellowstone National Park, almost 78% of fires are caused by lightning, while only 22% are human-caused. Most of the time, when a fire starts naturally by lightning here in Yellowstone, it burns less than an acre and puts itself out. But by suppressing all fire, the National Park Service was inadvertently allowing huge amounts of fuel to build up in the forests over decades. It's actually much safer ecologically to let natural fires periodically remove accumulations of fuel, such as pine needles, downed trees, and branches. The ecological understanding of fire began changing around the late 1960s and early 1970s. Scientists started to recognize that fire was not only natural, but also essential for the long-term health of many forest ecosystems, especially those in the western United States. They realized that when the parks were not on fire, they were actually facing other, more severe threats, such as an unnatural accumulation of dead, dry plant material. The most dramatic and consequential example of this fundamental policy shift occurred during the 1988 fire season in Yellowstone National Park. That year changed not only the National Park Service's policies, but also how the entire country viewed fires. A century of fire suppression had allowed fuels to build up over large areas of the park, creating a massive potential for destruction. Adding tremendously to this fuel accumulation were millions of dead trees left over from an insect infestation that had occurred about 9 years prior. Park managers initially thought they were on track for another good year in their natural fire program, following a wet spring. But then the rains abruptly stopped in May and June, and they didn't receive the spring moisture they were accustomed to. The Yellowstone fire of 1988 started as many small individual fires, but due to severe drought conditions and increasing winds, the flames quickly spread out of control. These separate fires combined into several massive fires that burned for months, almost destroying 2 major visitor destinations. For the first time in history, the entire park was closed to non-emergency personnel. The firefighting effort was immense. At its peak, more than 9,000 firefighters were assigned to fight the fire within the park. They were assisted by dozens of helicopters, fixed-wing aircraft, and fire-retardant drop planes. While these aircraft couldn't put out a big fire, they could retard portions of it, enough for crews to come in and do the real work of building line and mopping up. Even with the arrival and help of well over 2,000 United States Army troops around Yellowstone, there just weren't enough resources to put people and equipment everywhere they were needed. The firefighting effort alone cost almost $120 million. By the time the fire was finally brought to an end by the arrival of fall, subsequent snow and rain, over 793,000 acres had burned, covering about 36% of the park, either lightly or severely. This amount of burning was depressing to watch, as the acreage exceeded a quarter of Yellowstone's total area. But what happened next completely changed everyone's perspective on these fires. The key was the lodgepole pine tree. Lodgepole pines, which are commonly seen all over the park, have two different types of pine cones. They have a pine cone that opens regularly, just like other trees, but they also have what's called a serotinous pine cone. The second type of pine cone is covered by the tree with a resin or a sap before it opens, and it sits there on the tree. When a forest fire goes through a lodgepole pine forest, the heat from the fire melts that resin or sap, causing the pine cone to open and reseed the forest floor. This spectacular natural regeneration in Yellowstone was so rapid and comprehensive that no replanting effort was ever attempted by humans. 1/3 of Yellowstone burned in 1988, but the Park Service didn't plant a single tree. Today, some acres in Yellowstone have 1 million trees per acre. The vast majority of plants regrouped from existing sprouts that survived the heat and the fires, meaning nature planned the new growth. The fire had come through and purged the forest, allowing many plants to grow without worrying about the canopies above them. Scientists realized that the lodgepole pine tree only lives about 200 years. So if a forest fire doesn't go through a lodgepole pine forest every 200 years or so, the forest begins to die off, and then it's much harder for nature to grow a new forest. Therefore, in a lodgepole pine forest, they need to burn every so often to reseed the next generation. The 1988 fire happened pretty much right on schedule, as it had been a couple hundred years since a big fire event in Yellowstone, and fire is what drives this specific system. Contrary to what media reports at the time suggested, the fires killed very few park animals. The research showed that the old forest wasn't destroyed, it was simply changed. A young forest is every bit as natural as an old, unburned forest. As a result of the extensive research conducted after the fires, a new fire management plan was implemented in 1992. This new philosophy aims to maintain that natural role of fire in the landscape. Today, there's a big fork in the road for fire managers based on the cause of the fire. Any human-caused fire must be suppressed by federal policy. However, when a lightning fire occurs, which is about 80% of all fires, managers now have the full suite of options, including just monitoring that fire. This management is primarily about risk management, constantly assessing the risk posed to infrastructure, visitors, and employees. This deeper respect for natural processes extended to other parks as well. In the Sierra Nevada, for example, the ecosystem is fire adapted, and those forests need fire to be sustainable. Historically, lightning events would cause small fires that wouldn't spread, because there were no carrier fuels like grasses to move the fire around. Those fires would stay very small and go out quickly. Now, however, grasses have taken over and become the primary carrier of the fire, making it incredibly difficult to stop a fire and keep it small when a lightning or human-caused fire occurs. This necessitates careful and active management to reduce fuel loads. It's also understood that not all ecosystems benefit from fire. The desert, for instance, is not a fire-adapted ecosystem, and fires should not be present in those environments. There, fire opens the door to bringing in invasive plants that don't belong, because the native plants grow so slowly and take so much time to recover from the process of fire. The shift toward natural fire management reflects the National Park Service's continuous modernization as both environmental and visitor needs evolve. It's a recognition that sometimes the best way to preserve the land unimpaired for future generations is to allow natural processes to function, even if those processes seem destructive in the short term. It's like tending a garden by occasionally pruning a tree, knowing that the removal of the old wood is necessary for the new growth to truly thrive. Chapter 8. Modern Overcrowding. Social media, reservations, and visitor management. The modern era has presented the national park system with one of its most complex and immediate challenges: managing massive crowds of visitors. This dramatic increase in visitation, largely fueled by new social and cultural trends, has put immense pressure on the very lands the Park Service is tasked to preserve. For decades, national park visitation grew steadily, but that trend drastically accelerated starting around 2012 with the invention of social media and the rise of what's often called Instagram travel culture. It's now increasingly common to see many of America's natural wonders featured alongside big cities and theme parks as key places to visit. These parks are quickly becoming targets for social media influencers and a prize feature on many Instagram feeds. What concerns policymakers and rangers today is that visitation has doubled in recent years, with the most pronounced rise occurring in the last 5 years, and that trajectory shows no signs of stopping. This social media explosion not only created demand for historically popular locations that were already established within the park system, but it also single-handedly put certain American icons on the map. Consider the example of Horseshoe Bend. Just a few decades ago, it was a remote and relatively unknown spot along the Colorado River, known only by locals. As geotagging grew, so did the popularity of this spot, and almost overnight, this overlooked location that once saw 4,000 visitors a year began seeing 2.2 million visitors annually. That's more than 4,000 visitors every day. By 2016, the site saw so much traffic that it was necessary to build official visitor facilities on the property. The most astonishing thing about this location is that 20 years ago, it didn't even appear on maps, but now it is one of America's most recognizable spots. The sudden influx of visitors creates immediate problems. Upon entry to the park, visitors face long lines to get in. And once they're in the park, they spend their time searching for parking in overcrowded lots. This heavy traffic leads to congestion and makes finding a parking spot highly unpredictable for everyone. For places like Great Smoky Mountains National Park, America's most visited national park, it's not uncommon on a busy day to be unable to find a parking spot in most of the major parking areas for hours on end, and long traffic jams are frequent along many of the roads due to high visitation. The challenges of modern overcrowding were dramatically highlighted during the COVID-19 pandemic. In March 2020, many of the national parks initially closed their doors for the first time in history. For a few months, parks like Great Smoky Mountains National Park became absent of humans, one of its most iconic animals. Wildlife returned to many of the areas in the park that had been previously overrun with tourists. The national parks for a few months looked closer to a scene from a post-apocalyptic movie rather than a summer vacation spot, with locked doors and animals walking around the visitor centers. However, this absence didn't last long. The desire to escape the lockdowns drove many tourists to seek out the national parks. After people flocked to places like the Grand Canyon, the park was forced to close again. Many national parks quickly became trashed and overrun by this new mass of visitors. In 2021, most national parks were back to business as usual, but visitation hit above average highs each month. The Park Service had to find new ways to balance the core mission of preservation with the demand for public access. This led to the introduction of reservation systems, a major change that has reshaped how visitors travel in the national parks. The reservation system was first introduced as a crowd control measure during the pandemic. There was a limited number of slots available, and if you did not have a reservation, you were turned away. These reservations became a prize ticket due to the unique experience of exploring these parks during the time of reduced crowds. Today, many parks still use this system to help protect the landscape by limiting the impact that a large number of people can have on the environment. The vehicle reservation helps to reduce congestion, increase safety, and make finding a parking spot much more predictable for visitors. Park managers believe that if they can manage visitation in this way, it will actually enable them to get more visitors into the park without the crowded condition that is so disillusioning to them. They reason that people are already used to making reservations for their hotels, campsites, dinner, or river trips, so this new system should fit right into their vacation planning. Not all of the key attractions in the national park system, but many of them now have either seasonal or year-round restrictions. One of the most recent additions to the reservation list is Angel's Landing in Zion National Park. This location has become one of the most famous social media sites, a must-see on any traveler's feed. However, the sheer popularity of this high-altitude hike overshadows the inherent danger of the site. Beyond simple reservations, some parks have taken even more dramatic steps to manage crowds and fund essential maintenance. This is the case in Great Smoky Mountains National Park, where the Park at Ford program was adopted. For generations, Great Smoky Mountains had been a free park with easily accessible roads to explore the mountains. The free and open nature of the park has made it an iconic and accessible location. Unfortunately, the surge in visitation has overwhelmed many of the park's facilities. In response, the park implemented the Park at Ford program, requiring a parking pass along the roadway, effective in March 2023. This was a challenging decision for a park that had always been free, and it conflicted with the personal beliefs of some and the historical understanding of others who sold their lands to create the park. However, the overwhelming message from the public was that they valued the park and were willing to invest in protecting it for future generations. Policymakers stressed their duty to ensure the park is protected, that employees have the tools to do their jobs, and that future visitors have this sacred place to explore. These systems represent the most recent generation of crowd control systems being implemented across the national park system. They reflect the struggle to balance the mandate to conserve the land unimpaired for future generations with the equally important mission to promote its enjoyment by the public. While the emergence of social media and the explosion of visitors have created real stress on the infrastructure, these challenges have also spurred the National Park Service to embrace new management strategies and find innovative ways to preserve America's best idea in the modern age. Chapter 9, The Great American Outdoors Act, historic funding for infrastructure and maintenance. We're moving into the quiet history of the National Park Service in the 21st century now, focusing on a major legislative event that promised to fundamentally address a decades-long problem: the aging and crumbling physical infrastructure of America's protected lands. This is the story of the Great American Outdoors Act, a piece of legislation that delivered historic funding for park maintenance. By the time the 21st century was underway, the national park system had grown tremendously. It contained well over 400 units, encompassing everything from vast, iconic wilderness areas like Yellowstone and Grand Teton National Parks to historical battlefields and monuments. This expansion was made possible in part by earlier massive modernization efforts, most notably Mission 66, which ran until 1966. That program successfully upgraded park facilities to handle the growing number of visitors traveling by automobile. But facilities and buildings that were modernized during Mission 66, and even older infrastructure built by the Civilian Conservation Corps during the Great Depression, inevitably aged. Decades later, many of those structures and the infrastructure they relied on were in desperate need of significant repair and modernization. The National Park Service faced a growing and vast systemic problem. This issue manifested as a massive backlog of delayed maintenance projects. This meant that thousands of miles of paved roads, thousands of miles of trails, and tens of thousands of buildings across the national parks were still in need of immediate improvement. This immense list of necessary repairs and upgrades became a major barrier to the public's ability to enjoy and learn the stories of these amazing places. When the infrastructure is crumbling, it becomes harder for the public to feel a deep connection with the parks. For example, some visitor centers built as part of the original Mission 66 program were not well received by the public, and some were even torn down over the years, further illustrating the ongoing need for modern, well-maintained facilities. This deferred maintenance backlog was not just an inconvenience for visitors, it was a crisis impacting the safety and integrity of the parks. The estimated cost for delayed maintenance projects, repairs, and necessary upgrades needed to make the national parks greater than they had ever been before was nearly $10 billion. To put that number in perspective, it was a sum so immense that traditional annual appropriations weren't enough to tackle it. This accumulating crisis demanded a substantial political solution. What was urgently needed was a long-term, dedicated, and significant funding source to tackle this enormous backlog. The funding had to be steady and guaranteed, enabling the Park Service to plan and execute large, multi-year construction and repair projects. That solution finally arrived in 2020 with the passage of the Great American Outdoors Act. This legislation was widely seen as a major turning point for park funding and maintenance, representing a truly historic investment in America's parks at a critical time. It was developed and ultimately passed with bipartisan support, demonstrating a shared national commitment to safeguarding natural areas that transcended typical political divides. The legislation's champions emphasized that protecting wilderness reflects the best values of America, including environmental protection, stewardship of the land, and community partnership. The act built on the long-standing but often underfunded Land and Water Conservation Fund, which represented a bipartisan commitment to safeguarding natural areas. President Donald Trump signed the Great American Outdoors Act into law in 2020. He viewed it as building on his administration's unwavering commitment to conserving the grandeur and splendor of God's creation. Recognizing that national parks truly set America apart from the rest of the world. The centerpiece of this legislation was the establishment of the National Parks and Public Land Legacy Restoration Fund. This fund dedicated a massive $1.9 billion per year for 5 years specifically to fund the maintenance backlog of the National Park Service. This level of funding was unprecedented, marking a massive down payment on infrastructure aimed at preserving the many treasures within the national park system and giving Americans better opportunities to explore the great outdoors. The tangible impact of this dedicated funding was immediate and structural across the country. This funding was critical because the needs were immense. The backlog involved improving more than 5.5 thousand miles of paved roads, repairing 17,000 miles of trails, and renovating 24,000 buildings that provide shelter, education, and services across the system. To efficiently tackle this mountainous backlog, the National Park Service developed a new and innovative approach: regionally based maintenance action teams. These teams were composed of skilled tradespeople who would train and work alongside existing park facility crews. Their mission was to tackle high-priority deferred maintenance and repair projects. This approach wasn't just about fixing immediate problems. It was designed to build capacity within the park system. By engaging and training the next generation of park stewards, these maintenance action teams ensured that vital skills and knowledge were passed along, creating a more sustainable maintenance workforce for the future. These infrastructure updates directly and structurally improve the visitor experience. For instance, well-maintained trails and roads reduce hazards and make park navigation smoother and more predictable. When visitors don't have to deal with crumbling facilities or damaged roads, their focus can remain on the natural wonder and historical significance of the places they are exploring. Moreover, the funding had profound impacts on conservation and habitat protection. By dedicating resources to infrastructure within existing park boundaries, the Great American Outdoors Act ensures that the National Park Service can continue its primary mission to conserve the land unimpaired for future generations. For example, proper trail maintenance minimizes human impact on fragile ecosystems. In Channel Islands National Park, the rehabilitation efforts to bring back endangered animals like the Channel Island fox have been instrumental in restoring the island's ecology. The resulting extra vegetation stabilized the park's soil, which prevented runoff into the sea. This, in turn, kept the kelp forests surrounding the islands in pristine condition, benefiting the many marine species that depend on them. Dedicated funding for trail and road maintenance indirectly supports these conservation successes by controlling erosion and ensuring human activity is contained to designated functional areas. The Great American Outdoors Act was a necessary response to the reality of increasing visitor demand. The free and open nature of Great Smoky Mountains National Park, for instance, made it an iconic and accessible location for generations. However, the surge in visitation there overwhelmed many facilities, leading to long traffic jams and overcrowded parking lots on major roads. The overwhelming message from the public was clear. They valued the park and were willing to invest in protecting it. This historic legislation provided the comprehensive financial solution that allowed policymakers to fulfill their duty to ensure that parks are protected, that employees have the tools to do their jobs, and that future visitors have these sacred places to explore. The act was a profound political statement. It affirmed that despite political disagreements, the conservation of America's most precious places, its historical wonders, and its natural grandeur is a bipartisan priority. This legislation provided the financial muscle needed to back up the National Park Service's historical mandate. It was a recognition that preserving America's best idea requires not just passion and policy, but sustained and substantial monetary investment in the physical structures that make the parks accessible and enjoyable for the millions of visitors who come each year to explore, seek adventure, and connect with America's shared heritage. It secures a physical foundation upon which the National Park Service can modernize and adapt to future challenges, including environmental and visitor needs. It allows the Park Service to deliver deferred maintenance and facilities projects in a more effective, sustained, and holistic way, charting a course for the long-term health and accessibility of the parks. Chapter 10: Science, Stewardship, and Climate Threats, Protecting the Ecosystem Future. The story of America's national parks continues right up to this very moment, as the Park Service and its dedicated partners face the complex environmental pressures of the modern world. Tonight, we'll reflect on how modern science, dedicated stewardship, and local community knowledge are essential tools in protecting the ecosystem future of these irreplaceable lands against growing threats like climate change and biodiversity loss. The National Park Service operates today with a mission to conserve the scenery and the natural and historical objects unimpaired for future generations, while also promoting their enjoyment by the public. This core mission is now heavily reliant on science and research to understand exactly how the environment is shifting. In some places, scientists use the parks as living laboratories. For example, at Crater Lake, park scientists take the pulse of the lake every summer to resist the trajectory of change. This scientific work follows a three-part philosophy, often called the RAD philosophy. The goal is to resist change to the environment as much as possible, accept that there will be some change so long as the environment can still function as necessary, and direct that change whenever it is inevitable, to keep everything functioning as closely to normal as possible. This forward-looking approach is crucial for managing ecosystems that are under stress. One of the most immediate and profound challenges facing the parks today is a warming climate. Alaska, for instance, is warming faster than any other United States state. This temperature rise is already melting glaciers and threatening to upset the natural rhythm of life in places like Lake Clark National Park. This park is a vast, thriving wilderness, a pristine landscape that has been virtually unchanged for thousands of years. Its existence protects the headwaters of the largest sockeye salmon run on Earth, and this ecosystem is dependent on the natural cycles. The changing climate here is a reminder that the Park Service needs to protect America's national parks for all of our futures. We see the effects of temperature and climate shifts in parks across the continent. In Yosemite National Park, winters are becoming shorter, and temperatures are predicted to rise by 10 degrees in the next century. A hotter climate with less water could fundamentally alter this pristine landscape, which is currently home to one of the largest natural water supplies in California. Researchers like Anthony Ambrose and Wendy Baxter are already in the old-growth forests, studying the giant sequoias, monitoring the water status of these massive trees to indicate their health, and the wider conditions for all life in the park. They recognize that places like Yosemite are essential for the survival of the giant sequoias, which are already living under drought conditions. Increased heat and drought also contribute directly to the growing problem of wildfires. In the Grand Canyon, lightning storms are the main cause of fires, but recently, higher temperatures have led to more violent weather and intense blazes. Wildfires can stimulate new life by thinning the canopy and allowing more sunlight through. If the destruction is too extensive, it becomes a serious issue. The National Park Service learned an important lesson about fire management after the immense Yellowstone fire of 1988. A century of fire suppression had allowed vast amounts of fuel to build up, leading to a massive conflagration. Following extensive research, a new fire management plan was implemented in 1992, aiming to maintain the natural role of fire in the landscape. Scientists understood that in certain ecosystems, like the Lodgepole pine forests of Yellowstone, fire is essential for reseeding and driving the system. Today, human-caused fires are still suppressed, but when a lightning fire occurs, managers have the option of simply monitoring it, always balancing the need for natural processes with the risk posed to infrastructure and visitors. Beyond the visible threats, modern science is also addressing biodiversity loss and the introduction of invasive species. The work in Channel Islands National Park serves as a powerful blueprint for future conservation efforts. This forgotten wilderness, isolated from the mainland, is home to over 2,000 species of plants and animals, 145 of which are found nowhere else on Earth. After years of development and overgrazing by ranching livestock that left the islands barren and pushed native species close to extinction, conservation efforts have worked to restore the islands. A key success story is the Channel Island fox. In 2004, they were on the brink of extinction, but after years of protection by the park and its conservation partners, their numbers rebounded significantly. This animal's restoration has been key to the overall recovery of the islands. The foxes help disperse seeds from fruits like figs, cherries, and prickly pears, and their movements across the island are reseeding sources of food for generations to come. The resulting extra vegetation helps stabilize the park's soil, preventing runoff into the sea, which in turn keeps the kelp forests surrounding the islands in pristine condition, benefiting all the marine species that depend on them. The Park Service and its allies are giving the islands the time and space needed to heal. In other coastal parks, conservation focuses on protecting fragile marine environments from pollution and development. Biscayne National Park, right on the doorstep of Miami, is 95% underwater. Its seagrass meadows are vital, often called the rainforests of the sea, providing oxygen and locking in carbon with their roots. This habitat is critical for animals like the manatee, which needs 66 pounds of seagrass daily, and the tiny dwarf seahorse. However, outside the protected park waters, Florida has lost 50% of its seagrass beds since the 1950s due to polluted water and algal blooms. Biscayne's seagrass meadows, therefore, act as a vital oasis. Another essential element in modern conservation is the protection offered by mangrove forests. In Biscayne, these tangled trees absorb the power from storm surges, protecting the coastline and millions of people from destructive waves and erosion. Alongside seagrass, mangrove forests are a powerful tool in the fight against climate change because they can store 5 times more carbon than tropical forests like the Amazon. This role they play in the fight against climate change is truly priceless. Technology and research partnerships are central to modern park stewardship. Scientists are using technology like satellite maps, airboats, and helicopters to understand how the vegetation in the Everglades is changing. They also use complex models that incorporate precipitation, river flows, tides, storm winds, and atmospheric pressures to predict storm effects, both with and without anticipated future sea levels. This helps people working on the ground in parks see what areas are susceptible to impacts, and plan for the future. Research extends to understanding endangered wildlife in detail. For instance, the Voyageurs Wolf Project heads up research in Voyageurs National Park, a place where wolves have lived continuously for 8,000 years. Researchers collar the adult wolves to track their movements and even tag the pups with a microchip to follow their every move. They also analyze hair samples for DNA testing and weigh the pups to find out how healthy they are. This detailed research builds a fuller picture of how many wolves live in the park, what they eat, and where they go, helping the team devise a plan to protect this remarkable species, not just in Voyageurs, but in forests across America and beyond. Finally, the role of local communities and traditional knowledge has gained immense respect in modern park management. This partnership is crucial for managing the future of these protected areas. In Lake Clark National Park, the Dena'ina people have been in their homelands for thousands of years, living off the land. Ruth Miller, a Dena'ina community member, explains that her people maintain a deep spiritual connection to this place. They rely on the timing of the salmon runs and live sustainably with the land, practicing gratitude and striving to give more than they take. This Dena'ina way of life is a timely reminder that we aren't separate from nature, but an integral part of it. Similarly, in Hawaii Volcanoes National Park, where the land is strongly connected to deities and spirits, the traditional value of aloha aina, or deep appreciation and love for the features of the land, means realizing that one is not whole without one's place. Doctor. Sam Ohugan advocates for the integration of Hawaiian values and knowledge, recognizing that the fate and health of their place is their own fate and health. This indigenous connection emphasizes the profound stewardship needed to protect their home and its endemic species, like the native Ohia lehua tree, which is now threatened by foreign fungal disease. The National Park Service, supported by historic funding from the Great American Outdoors Act, now has the resources to back this commitment to science and stewardship. This act provides dedicated funding for maintenance and facility projects, ensuring that the physical infrastructure supports the mission of preservation. It also funds the next generation of park stewards, recognizing that the future of America's best idea depends on a well-trained, knowledgeable public and workforce. Ultimately, modern park management is a gentle dance between protecting the parks from modern threats and ensuring that the public can still experience the wonder that first inspired the creation of these protected areas over a century ago. By embracing science, technology, community wisdom, and public education, the National Park Service is working to ensure that the majesty of places like Grand Teton, Yellowstone, and Biscayne will continue to provide sanctuary and inspiration for generations of Americans to come. Chapter 11, The Yellowstone Fire of 1988 and the Birth of Modern Fire Ecology Policy. We can now settle into the story of a dramatic moment in the history of our national parks, a time when a great fire changed how we think about nature itself and fundamentally reshaped the way we approach managing our wildest landscapes. We're going to talk about the Yellowstone fires of 1988, an event that seemed like an overwhelming disaster, but proved to be a powerful, essential lesson in renewal and resilience. For many decades, the policy within the National Park Service and the Forest Service regarding fire was very simple and quite firm. Fires were generally believed to be detrimental to the parks and forests, and the clear management goal was always to suppress them as quickly as possible. This policy, which viewed fire as an enemy, was established firmly as early as 1935, when the United States Forest Service adopted a strict mandate. This policy dictated that wildfires were supposed to be suppressed by 10 a.m. the morning they were first spotted, establishing a rigid benchmark for response time. To enforce this goal, extensive efforts and infrastructure were built throughout the American public lands. Firefighting apparatus and necessary location finding and communication lines became standard equipment in all national parks. Teams of firefighting crews, often staffed by young men, were established across the public lands, especially during the fire season. These efforts were highly successful in visibly reducing the area burned by wildfires across the country. By the beginning of World War II, more than 8,000 fire lookout towers alone had been constructed throughout the United States. The success of these efforts was undeniable. The area burned by wildfires annually was reduced significantly, dropping from an average of 30 million acres in the 1930s down to between 2 and 5 million acres by the 1960s. This aggressive policy was reinforced by the realities of the time, particularly during World War II when the need for lumber was high, making any fire that destroyed valuable timberland unacceptable. Even after the war, the public perception was strongly against fire, fueled partly by iconic campaigns like the one started by the United States Forest Service in 1944 using the cartoon Black Bear named Smokey. These campaigns educated the public that wildfires were detrimental and often led people to mistakenly believe that most wildfires were predominantly caused by humans. However, this long and successful period of fire suppression had a severe and unintended consequence. It short-circuited a critical natural system. For many forest ecosystems, particularly those adapted to periodic burning, it's actually much safer to allow natural fires to periodically remove accumulations of fuel on the forest floor. These fuels include things like pine needles, downed trees, branches, and dead plant material. When fire is successfully suppressed for decades, these fuels build up over large continuous areas of the park. This meant that when a fire finally did start, it had much more material to burn, allowing the blaze to become much more intense, massive, and ultimately uncontrollable. This buildup of fuel was the foundational factor that led to the Great Fires of 1988 in Yellowstone National Park. In the years leading up to 1988, the forest conditions were already primed for a catastrophic burn. An insect infestation, which had occurred roughly 9 years prior, had left millions of dead trees standing across the park, adding tremendously to the accumulated fuel load. The entire forest was essentially a dry, heavy stockpile of burnable material. What the forest needed then was a spark and the right weather conditions. The fire season of 1988 began deceptively, which contributed to the surprise of the scale of the disaster. Park managers noted that the spring was wet, and they initially thought they were on track for another good year in their natural fire program, which had been implemented to allow some lightning-caused fires to burn naturally under careful monitoring. But then the moisture stopped completely in May and June. The spigot, as it were, shut off, and the park entered a period of severe, prolonged drought. When the fires started, they quickly grew in intensity and spread out of control due to these severe drought conditions combined with increasing winds. The Yellowstone Fire of 1988 was not just one single fire, but rather many small individual fires that collectively grew into the largest wildfire on record in the park. These separate initial fires soon combined into several larger, intense blazes that burned relentlessly for several months. The fires themselves were often mixed, meaning they burned in different ways simultaneously. They burned both high in the canopy of the trees and low in the vegetation on the ground. The ground fires, which spread slowly along the surface, consuming dead plant material and small plants, often burned intensely and for long durations. This intense, long-duration ground burning eventually contributed to the loss of many trees whose canopies were never directly burned by the flames above. The severity of the situation required an unprecedented and enormous response effort. For the first time in its history, the entire park was closed completely to non-emergency personnel. At the peak of the crisis, more than 9,000 firefighters were assigned to the effort within the park. These brave individuals were assisted by dozens of helicopters, fixed-wing aircraft, and planes dropping fire retardant. Although fire retardant planes alone cannot put out a big fire, they can retard portions of it enough for crews to come in and do the real back-breaking work of building lines and mopping up. Even the military was called in to assist with the suppression efforts, with well over 2,000 United States Army troops arriving around Yellowstone to help. Eventually, more than 4,000 military personnel were brought in to aid the suppression. Firefighters even used high-tech methods, such as using aircraft to unroll a long continuous line of fire line explosive to quickly construct a first-class fire line, taping together the ends and using electrical blasting caps to initiate the rapid construction. This massive firefighting effort alone cost almost $120 million. Despite all these colossal efforts, the intense burning continued to rage until fall finally arrived, bringing the necessary moisture to suppress the flames. By the time the fire was fully extinguished, over 793,000 acres had burned, either lightly or severely, amounting to approximately 36% of the park's total area. However, the consequences for human infrastructure were minimal, because firefighters concentrated their primary efforts around visitor areas and high-priority structures. Incredibly few buildings were lost, and those that burned were not considered among the high-priority structures in the settlement. The total damage to structures amounted to around $3.2 million. The most profound change that occurred was not in the loss, but in the recovery, which fundamentally altered the perspective of the public, the scientists and the managers watching the land. While media reports at the time often sensationalized the destruction, the land itself proved instantly resilient. The fires killed very few of the park animals, as they possessed the instinctual knowledge to move away from the path of the flames. The recovery was driven largely by the ecology of the lodgepole pine trees, which are common across Yellowstone. Lodgepole pines have two different types of pine cones. One type opens regularly, like other trees, but the other type is known as a serotinous pine cone. The tree covers this second type of pine cone with a resin or a sap before it opens, and it sits there on the tree, sometimes for decades. When a forest fire goes through a lodgepole pine forest, the intense heat from the fire warms up that resin or sap, causing the pine cone to finally open and immediately reseed the forest floor below. This natural regeneration was so fast and so comprehensive that the park never attempted any replanting effort whatsoever. Nature planted the trees. In fact, some acres in Yellowstone ended up having 1 million new trees per acre after the event. Furthermore, the vast majority of other plants regrouped successfully from existing sprouts that had survived the heat and the fires. The ecological lesson was undeniable and clear. The old forest was not destroyed, but rather it was fundamentally changed, and the land was prepared for the next forest. Scientists recognize that fire is necessary for this cycle, particularly in lodgepole pine environments. If a forest fire does not go through a lodgepole pine forest every 200 years or so, the forest will simply start dying off, making it much harder for nature to grow a new forest. The 1988 fires were characterized by scientists as being pretty much right on schedule, as it had been a couple of 100 years since a big fire event in Yellowstone, and this natural purging is what drives the health of the system. The fire came through and purged the old growth, allowing the new plants to grow without worrying about the canopies above them, thus advancing our understanding of renewal and resilience in nature. As a direct result of the extensive research and observation conducted after the 1988 fires, a new fire management plan was formally implemented in 1992. This modern approach seeks to continue maintaining the natural role of fire in the landscape. Today, fire managers face what they call a pretty big fork in the road depending on the cause of the fire. By federal policy, any fire caused by humans is still required to be suppressed. However, about 80% of the fires in Yellowstone are naturally caused by lightning. When a lightning fire occurs, managers now have the full suite of options available, which can be everything from simply monitoring that fire to active suppression. The modern approach is primarily focused on risk management, meaning that the top priority is assessing the risk posed to infrastructure, visitors, and employees. This recognition confirms that fire is not always a destructive enemy, but rather a necessary force of nature. This event taught us all that in a place like Yellowstone, where we deliberately choose to let nature take its course, fire is every bit as natural as an old, unburnt forest. The Yellowstone fires of 1988 ultimately helped the National Park Service and the public gain a better understanding of the essential role that fire plays in the continuous natural cycle of our protected lands, confirming that a young forest is every bit as natural as an old forest. Chapter 12, Social Media, Visitation Explosions, and the Implementation of Timed Entry Systems. Let's drift into the story of the modern age of the national parks, a time when technology changed everything, from how we discover a remote trail to how we book a spot to see a famous view. We're talking about the rise of social media and the subsequent explosion in visitors, which brought new challenges to the core mission of preservation. National park visitation has always grown steadily over the decades, a slow and predictable increase reflecting population growth and better roads. But that predictable pattern changed dramatically with the invention of social media and the emergence of what's called the Instagram travel culture. Starting around 2012, it became increasingly common to see many of America's natural wonders featured right alongside famous cities and theme parks as must-see places. The parks have always been a draw, but with the emergence of social media, they quickly became a target for social media influencers and a coveted feature on many Instagram feeds. This social media phenomenon created an immense demand for historically popular locations that were already well established within the park system. But perhaps more astonishingly, social media single-handedly put some American icons on the map that were previously unknown. Take the example of Horseshoe Bend, a spectacular overlook along the Colorado River. It was once a remote and generally unknown spot, save for local residents. As geotagging grew in popularity, so did this isolated location almost overnight. This overlooked spot, which once saw only about 4,000 visitors a year, began seeing a massive 2.2 million visitors annually. That's more than 4,000 visitors every single day. By 2016, the location saw so much traffic that it was necessary to build official facilities on the property to manage the crowds. The site now sees thousands of visitors daily, and the most astonishing thing is that this famous location did not even appear on maps just 20 years ago. Now it is one of America's most recognizable locations. The problem, however, is that this trajectory of rapidly rising visitation, which has doubled in recent years and has been most pronounced in the last 5 years, shows no signs of stopping. This massive influx of people puts tremendous pressure on the park infrastructure and the visitor experience. When visitors arrive at the park, they often face long lines just to get in. Once inside, they may spend significant time searching for a place to park in overcrowded parking lots. This strain was apparent across many parks. The free and open nature of Great Smoky Mountains National Park, America's most visited national park, made it especially accessible. But in recent decades, it saw a massive surge in visitation, overwhelming many of its facilities. It became common on a busy day not to be able to find a parking spot in most major parking areas for hours on end. And traffic jams due to high visitation were frequent along many of the roads. This explosion in visitors creates a significant tension at the very core of the National Park Service's mission, which is the balance between preservation and public use. While the National Park Service is tasked with conserving the scenery and the natural and historical objects within the parks for future generations, it also needs to provide access and regulation for current visitors. Millions of people flocking to the most picturesque spots means trails, parking areas, and sensitive ecosystems are strained beyond their original capacity. When new mass visitors arrived, many national parks quickly became trashed and overrun as people explored the landscapes. The popularity of sites like Angel's Landing in Zion National Park, which became one of the most recent famous social media locations and a must-see on any traveler's feed, overshadowed the inherent danger of the hike and the simple logistics of crowd management on narrow trails. The pressure reached a peak with the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. At first, many national parks closed their doors, but they left their gates open, leading to a strange absence of one of the most iconic animals, humans. Wildlife returned to many areas in the park that had been previously overrun with tourists. For a few months, the parks looked closer to a scene from a post-apocalyptic movie rather than a summer vacation spot, with locked doors and many animals walking around the visitor centers. But this period did not last long. The desire to escape the long lockdowns drove many tourists to seek out national parks, viewing them as a necessary escape, a refuge for many Americans during the pandemic and good for the soul. The influx of tourists led to high visitation, but this unusual state, with little to no traffic, offered a unique, if sometimes chaotic, experience for those who could get in. Some people hated the crowds, others were envious of those who got to explore Yosemite with little to no traffic and the wildlife running free, but everyone could appreciate the unique experience. By 2021, most national parks were back to business as usual, but visitation continued to hit above average highs each month. This sustained crush of visitors brought about a new change that reshaped how visitors plan their trips, the implementation of the timed entry system. The reservation system was first introduced as a crowd control measure during the pandemic. In parks like Acadia, if a visitor wanted to drive a personal vehicle to the summit of Cadillac Mountain between certain hours, they needed to buy a vehicle reservation in addition to a park entrance pass. Since there were a limited number of slots available, if you did not have a reservation, you were turned away. These reservations quickly became a prize ticket, highly desired due to the unique experience of exploring these parks during a time of limited crowds. The The reservation system dramatically changed how visitors travel in the national parks. The vehicle reservation system was designed to help reduce congestion, increase safety, and make finding a parking spot much more predictable for visitors. Managers realized that if they could manage visitation in this way, it would actually enable them to get more visitors into the park without having the crowded condition that is so disillusioning to them. The Park Service recognized that modern visitors are already used to making reservations for many aspects of their trip, including hotels, campsites, dinner, and river trips, the timed entry. Systems were expected to fit right in with current vacation planning habits. Many key attractions in the national park system now have either seasonal or year-round restrictions. This is evident in the implementation of the Park at Forward program in Great Smoky Mountains National Park, which required a parking pass along the roadway. This program, announced in 2022, was adopted due to the overwhelming surge in visitation that was overwhelming many park facilities. The overriding message from the public was clear. They valued the park and were willing to invest in protecting it for future generations. This move toward reservation systems and fees is the most recent generation of crowd control systems being implemented across the national park system to protect the landscape by limiting the impact that large numbers of people can have on the environment. Modern technology, including social media platforms, mobile applications, and digital communication, has fundamentally reshaped the visitor experience while simultaneously challenging the mission of preservation. The same technology that makes a remote location viral and creates massive visitation strains is also used by the Park Service to implement solutions like the timed entry system. Apps and online platforms are essential for administering the reservation systems, communicating real-time information to visitors, and promoting education campaigns aimed at protecting the landscape. For example, the National Park Service has embraced these challenges by offering programs that encourage and educate visitors on how to respect these lands and follow leave no trace outdoor ethics. These ethics are a series of conscious decisions that outdoor users can make in order to reduce their impacts on the environment. Visitors are encouraged to stick to the trail and avoid creating social trails by wandering off. Ultimately, geotagging and social media might have put many remote areas in danger, but they have also encouraged millions more people to get out and enjoy these areas in the first place, often for the first time. The goal now is fostering a deeper connection. If a person feels like they're participating and truly connecting to the parks, they'll feel a sense of responsibility and stewardship, a passionate connection to the nature that they got to experience. This shift represents the ongoing journey to maintain the balance, ensuring that America's national parks remain accessible to millions, while also being preserved, unimpaired, for the generations to come. Thinking about this modern challenge is a little like trying to manage a spectacular, but very fragile, glass sculpture in a museum. The sculpture, our national parks, is so beautiful that everyone rushes to see it, causing crowding and even accidental damage. The timed entry system is like installing a velvet rope and requiring tickets for specific viewing times. It doesn't stop people from seeing the art, but it controls the crowd flow so everyone can enjoy the masterpiece safely, and the art itself is protected from being accidentally damaged by an overwhelming rush. Thank you for joining me on this quiet journey through the history of America's national parks. If you found comfort here, if this story helped you relax, please take a moment to like this video. It helps more than you might realize, especially with the way YouTube decides what to share with others. And if you'd like to hear more calm stories like this, about the hidden corners and timeless places of American history, consider subscribing. I post new videos every week, so you'll always have another story waiting for you at bedtime. Now, rest easy knowing the journey is complete. The forests, rivers, and open skies remain, waiting for anyone who needs a little peace. Sleep well, and may your dreams carry you to a quiet trail beneath the stars. And if you're still awake, that's all right too. Let your breathing slow, let your body rest, and know that the next story will be here waiting for you soon.